am telling this story because for a long time, I couldn't even say out loud what I was living. I'm telling it because maybe someone on the other side is feeling exactly what I felt, but still can't explain it. I didn't live for myself. I lived for others, and it took me far too long to realize that. From a very young age, I learned that I had to be strong, not because I wanted to, but because it seemed there was no other choice. I learned to swallow my tears, to smile when it hurt, to say, I'm fine, when nothing was, and little by little, my happiness was pushed to the very end. Always last. In my relationships, I always gave more attention, more care, more love. I gave myself completely, believing that love meant this, forgetting myself, so I wouldn't lose the other person. I believed that if I were enough, if I tried a little harder, if I were understanding enough, I would be chosen, but I never was. I lived trying not to bother anyone, trying not to complain, trying not to ask for anything. Because deep down, I was afraid of being left, afraid of being replaced, afraid of hearing that I was too much, or worse than I wasn't enough. So I stayed silent. Many times. I accepted things that hurt me. Harsh words, absences disguised as routine, promises that were never kept. And I kept telling myself, it's just a phase. He will change. I need to be more patient. But in truth, the one who was changing was me. I was shrinking. I began to adapt myself to fit into his world. I changed the way I spoke, the way I acted, the way I felt. I started measuring my words to avoid conflict. I started hiding my feelings to keep the peace, a peace that only existed because I was silent. There were nights when I cried alone. I cried quietly. I cried in secret, not because I didn't trust anyone, but because I didn't want to be a burden. I felt a strange loneliness because I wasn't alone, yet I didn't feel accompanied. It was like being next to someone and still feeling invisible. Over time, I no longer knew who I was. Outside that relationship, I didn't know what I liked, what I wanted, what I dreamed of. I only knew how to care, to please, to wait. I became the woman who holds everything together, but no one holds her. And the more I gave, the more people got used to it, to my presence, to my care, to my love. But no one asked if I was okay too, because I never taught how I wanted to be loved. I only taught that I could be put last until one day I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized who I saw. My eyes were tired, my smile was automatic, and my heart was exhausted. And for the first time, I thought, at what moment did I stop living for myself? First person narrative, emotional awakening, human. After that question, nothing was ever the same, because when that question appears, it doesn't come to hurt you. It comes to wake you up. At first, I tried to ignore it, pretend I didn't hear it, go back to my routine, go back to being who I had always been. But I couldn't anymore. Something inside me had broken, or maybe it had finally awakened. I started to notice small things, silences that lasted too long, cold replies, a lack of care, disguised as normal. And for the first time, I stopped asking myself, what did I do wrong? And started asking, why do I accept this? That question hurt more than any abandonment, because the answer didn't point to the other person, it pointed to me. I realized I had spent years trying to prove my worth, trying to be loving enough, patient enough, understanding enough, but never whole enough for myself. I realized I was shaping myself to avoid being rejected, making myself smaller so I wouldn't lose anyone, erasing myself just to be chosen. And still, I remained alone. It was painful to admit that I wasn't there because of love. I was there because of fear. Fear of starting over. Fear of being alone. Fear of discovering who I was without someone by my side, because when you live to take care of others, looking at yourself is terrifying. I started to notice how I treated myself, how I spoke to myself, how had demanded so much from myself all the time. I gave myself no rest, no comfort, no forgiveness. I demanded from myself what no one had ever demanded, and accepted from others what I never should have accepted, and that exhausted me in a different way. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was soul-deep exhaustion, an exhaustion of existing without being seen, without being chosen, without being a priority. One day, I realized I was waiting for crumbs of attention as if they were love, and that realization shamed me, but it also freed me, because in that moment, I understood I wasn't asking for too much. I was accepting too little. Slowly, almost with guilt, I began to make small choices for myself, saying no when I wanted to say no, staying silent when I no longer had the strength to explain everything. I began to listen to myself, even while trembling, even while afraid. And the more I listened, the more I realized how deeply I had abandoned myself. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy. There were days I wanted to go back to become the woman who accepted everything, because that hurt less than being alone. But I already knew too much to pretend I didn't see. I began to understand that love should not hurt all the time. That presence should not wound. That silence should not suffocate. I understood that someone who loves me does not make me doubt my worth, does not make me beg for attention, does not make me feel small. And for the first time, I felt something different. It wasn't happiness yet, but it was respect for myself. I was still afraid. It still hurt. There was still longing for what I imagined, not for what I lived. But I was with myself, and that changed everything. Because when you stop abandoning yourself, the world starts to feel uncomfortable. Some people walk away. Others try to blame you. Others miss the version of you who accepted everything. But you start to breathe again. And that day, looking at myself with all my flaws, with all my scars, I made a silent promise. I will never love myself last again. I started to realize that something was wrong, not when he left, but when I no longer knew who I was, even with him still there. On the outside, I functioned. I smiled when I needed to. I answered when someone called my name, but inside, it felt like I was always silent. Even when everything around me was loud, I felt a pain I couldn't explain. It wasn't dramatic crying. It was a constant weight on my chest, a feeling of always being lacking, as if I needed to do more, be more, endure more, just to deserve love. I began to observe myself, and that was terrifying. I noticed, I apologized, even when I wasn't wrong. I softened my voice so I wouldn't bother anyone. I swallowed my words just to avoid conflicts that were never mine. I looked at myself in the mirror and felt that the woman staring back at me was tired of trying to be accepted. That's when I started paying attention to people, not to what they said, but to what they didn't say. I began to read their eyes, the long silences, the empty responses, the promises that came without action. And I understood something painful. I adapted myself too much to others because I was afraid of being abandoned. I realized that many people around me didn't truly know me. They only knew the version of me that caused no trouble, the version that always understood, the version that always stayed. That hurt because I realized I had never shown myself completely either. I began to remember my own story, how I learned early on that loving meant molding myself, that being good meant staying quiet, that being chosen meant not asking for too much. And there, in that quiet moment with myself, I understood that this pain was not weakness. It was a call for change. My body was tired. My mind was tired. My soul was asking for rest. I started noticing how I felt after conversations. Some left me empty. Some made me feel smaller. And very few left me at peace. That's when something inside me began to change. Not beautifully, not quickly, but honestly, I understood that I needed to stop trying to be loved and start being truthful with myself. And that realization didn't free me immediately, but it woke me up. Waking up didn't feel powerful. It felt uncomfortable, because once you see yourself, you can't unsee it. I started noticing how much of my life was built on self-abandonment. How many times I said yes, while my body was screaming no. And that scared me. I felt guilty for wanting space, guilty for needing silence, guilty for imagining a version of myself that didn't exist to please others. I asked myself questions I had avoided for years. Who am I when I'm not trying to be enough for someone? What do I actually feel when I stop numbing myself? Some answers didn't come gently. I realized I stayed in places where love felt like pressure, where affection felt conditional, where I was praised for enduring, not for being. And I understood something even harder. I wasn't only afraid of losing people, I was afraid of disappointing them by becoming myself, because becoming myself meant changing, and change meant risk. I began to feel lonely, even when surrounded by people. Not because they left, but because I was slowly leaving the version of me they were comfortable with. There were days I wanted to go back to who I was before. The one who stayed quiet, the one who adjusted, the one who didn't ask. Not because she was happy, but because she was familiar. Growth felt like grief. Grief for the woman I had been. Grief for the love I thought I had. But deep down, beneath the fear, there was something new forming. A small voice, still fragile, still unsure, but honest. And for the first time, I didn't silence it. I listened, and that was the beginning. At some point, I started to watch myself from the outside, as if I were observing my own life without being able to interfere. I saw a tired woman, not physically, but tired on the inside, tired of trying to be understood, tired of explaining myself, tired of waiting for gestures that never came. I realized that I was no longer asking for much. Actually, I was barely asking for anything at all, because deep down, I knew that asking hurt more than accepting the silence. I shaped myself. I adapted. I shrank my desires, my wishes, my dreams, not because he asked me to, but because I learned that loving for me meant giving in. And that was frightening, because I understood that I no longer knew who I was. Outside of that relationship, my choices revolved around him. My mood depended on him. My peace depended on him. And when I tried to remember who I was before, the image became blurred. That was when something started to hurt in a different way. It wasn't no longer just sadness. It was emptiness, an emptiness that could not be filled with presence, with promises, or with excuses. I began to feel that I was betraying myself every single day, in small ways. When I swallowed my tears, when I pretended I was fine, when I accepted less than I deserved, just to avoid losing. And for the first time, a question began to echo inside me. How long will I keep abandoning myself so I won't be abandoned? That question didn't give me answers, but it woke me up. And even with fear, even without knowing how, I felt that this was not the end of my story, but it could no longer be the same beginning. I didn't leave in a moment of anger. I didn't leave because I stopped loving. I left because I finally started to love myself enough to stop disappearing. There was no dramatic goodbye, no long explanations, just a quiet decision made inside my chest, and I realized that staying was costing me my identity. That loving him meant losing myself, and love should never require that kind of sacrifice. I stopped asking why I wasn't enough. I stopped wondering what I could do better, because the truth was simple and painful and freeing. I was never asking for too much. I was just asking someone who couldn't give the moment. One chose myself. Something changed. The fear didn't disappear, but the weight did. I felt lighter, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. I began to recognize myself again, slowly, gently. I remembered my voice, my desires, my boundaries, and I understood that losing someone is painful, but losing yourself is unbearable. This wasn't the end of love. It was the end of self-abandonment. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't surviving anymore. I was returning to who I had always been. If you're listening to this and something inside you feels tight, this message is for you. Love should not feel like constant effort. It should not feel like silence you have to decode or pain you have to justify. If you're always explaining your feelings, minimizing your needs, or convincing yourself to accept less, that's not love, that's survival. Here is the truth. No one told us you don't lose love by choosing yourself. You lose yourself by staying where you are not seen. The right love does not ask you to shrink. It does not require you to disappear, to be kept. If being with someone costs you your peace, your voice, your sense of self, the price is too high. Let this be your awakening, not to leave in anger, but to stay awake, not to harden your heart, but to protect it. You are not broken. You are not too much. You're simply remembering that you deserve a love that feels safe, clear, and whole. And the moment you understand this, everything changes.